a miniature artist named Annie is left devastated by her daughter's untimely death.
Raise your voice at me! I am your mother!
And becomes obsessed with summoning her spirit. Despite her son and husband's reluctance, she forces them to join her in a seance. As they then wonder if it truly worked, Annie suddenly gets possessed by her daughter's spirit.
Why are you scaring me?
A few weeks earlier, a man named Steve wakes up his son Peter so he can get dressed for his grandmother's funeral service. He also checks his daughter's room to get her ready, but he realizes that she didn't sleep there. As he then checks her treehouse, Steve sees his daughter Charlie still sleeping. He doesn't look happy about this, and as he wakes her up, he complains about how Charlie has been sleeping in the treehouse for a while now. Shortly after, Steve drives his family, including his wife, Annie, to the funeral service. When they arrive, Annie looks surprised to see a lot of mourners for her mother, Ellen, and during her speech, she mentions that it's quite surprising to see that a lot of people liked her mom. After her speech, the guests pay their last respects. And as each person goes to look at Ellen's dead body, Charlie watches them with special interest. As she then starts eating a chocolate bar, Steve comes over to ask if it has no nuts because of her allergy. Charlie says it doesn't, and after a while, the family returns home. When they arrive, Annie goes to see Charlie because she knows how fond she was of Ellen. While in her daughter's room, Annie sees Charlie's sketchbook with a drawing of someone who looks like Ellen. Annie asks Charlie about the drawing, but she says nothing. Annie then tells Charlie that Ellen liked her a lot. However,
you know you were her favorite, right?
Charlie doesn't think so, and she says that Ellen always wanted her to be a boy. Annie tells her it means nothing, and she also mentions that if Charlie feels sad and wants to cry about Ellen's death, she's free to do so. Following this, Annie goes to check the box containing her mom's old things. While she's at it, Annie stumbles on a book about spiritualism. However, as she opens the first page, she sees a note written by her mom, apologizing for how she has been through the years. Annie doesn't seem interested, so she just returns the book. As she heads out of the storeroom, Annie suddenly sees a strange figure in the dark. This scares her, but as she turns on the light, there appears to be nothing there. The next day, while Charlie is at school, a bird hits her class window and dies. Even though everyone is surprised by this, Charlie doesn't seem moved as she looks at the scissors on the teacher's table. After class, Charlie then heads out with the scissors to cut off the dead bird's head so she can keep it. Later that day, while Annie is working on her miniature art, which is due to be submitted to a gallery soon, Steve arrives home, so she leaves her work to go and see him. On her way, she sees that Ellen's room door is open, and this seems strange to her. As she then walks to the room, she sees that no one is inside. However, she also sees a triangle drawn on the floor. Annie eventually ignores it and heads out to ask Steve if he opened the door, but he says he didn't. As they then lock the door properly with a key, Steve gets a call from the cemetery where Ellen was buried. While speaking to the cemetery representative, Steve learns that Ellen's grave has been desecrated. This leaves him shocked, but as Annie asks what the problem is, he says it's nothing. Following this, she then says she's heading to the cinema to watch a movie. After a while, though, it turns out that Annie is lying, and she actually left the house to attend a group therapy session, which she doesn't want her family to know about. During the session, Annie is allowed to speak, and she talks about her mom's death and how she doesn't know how to react to it because her mom was always bad to her. She also adds that she didn't talk to Ellen for a long time until she gave birth to Charlie, who her mom eventually raised. She then mentions that her family has always been chaotic because while Ellen was mentally ill, her dad died due to his psychotic depression.
And my father died when I was a baby.
On top of that, Annie also explains that her brother battled with schizophrenia until he took his own life and left a note blaming Ellen for always putting people inside him. As she starts to feel sad, Annie says she now blames herself for letting Ellen raise Charlie because they ended up being closer than she wanted. The next day, while Charlie is in her room, she suddenly sees a glowing orb moving around her. When the orb eventually disappears through the window, Charlie strangely stares outside. Meanwhile, Peter gets invited to a party, so he tells Annie to let him go. Even though she initially refuses, Annie says she'll change her mind if he takes Charlie with him. Peter reluctantly agrees, but as he checks his sister's room, he sees that she's not there. Elsewhere, Charlie leaves her treehouse while holding the dead bird's head. She also continues to click her tongue as she walks through the bushes until she sees a strange person sitting in the middle of a fire. While she watches, Annie suddenly shows up and scolds her for leaving the house barefooted. As Annie then drags Charlie to the house, the little girl mentions that she wants her grandma. However, Annie just takes her inside and tells her to follow Peter to the party. Charlie says she doesn't want to go, but Annie insists because she wants her daughter to get over Ellen's death and make some friends. Even though it's against her wishes, Charlie follows Peter, who drives Annie's car to the party. When they arrive, Peter can't wait to hang out privately with his friends, so he tells Charlie to stop following him around. He also tells her to eat some of the cake at the party while he goes to meet his friends. Charlie does as she's told, but it turns out that the cake contains nuts, and this triggers her allergy. As she starts having a serious allergic reaction, she quickly finds Peter so he can help her. Peter looks scared to see his sister struggling to breathe, so he immediately puts her inside the car and leaves the party so he can find the nearest hospital. On the way, Charlie's allergic reaction worsens to the extent that she puts her head outside the window to get some air. Seeing as he could lose his sister, Peter starts driving at a high speed. Unfortunately, though, a dead deer appears in front of him, and as he swerves to avoid it, Charlie's head hits a telephone pole. When the car finally stops, Peter looks shocked as he appears to have stopped hearing Charlie's voice. As he realizes that she has been decapitated, he silently drives home while looking terrified. When he arrives, Peter walks up to his room and says nothing to his parents, who are already sleeping. The next morning, while Peter is still awake as he can't believe his sister is gone, he hears Annie's screams as she appears to have found Charlie's headless body still at the back of the car. This leaves her devastated, and even Steve can't seem to console her as she keeps crying uncontrollably. After Charlie's funeral, Annie starts spending more time in her treehouse. Peter also can't help but feel guilty for what happened to his sister. Days later, Annie leaves home to attend her group therapy session. However, before she goes in, she changes her mind and decides to return home. As she's driving out of the premises, a lady in her group named Joan stops her and asks why she's not going inside. Annie says she forgot something.
I forgot something.
But Joan thinks it's more than that. She then asks how Annie is now feeling about Ellen's death, but she mentions that she came this time because her daughter just died. Joan feels sorry for her and says she understands how Annie is feeling because she just lost her son and grandson too. She then writes her house address and offers to be available whenever Annie wants to talk about her feelings. That night, Annie struggles to sleep in her room, so she decides to head to Charlie's treehouse, even though Steve is not a fan of this. Elsewhere, Peter starts hearing a tongue-clicking sound in his room, as it's something he knows Charlie did a lot. This leaves him extremely scared. The next day, Annie finally decides to visit Joan. When she gets to Joan's apartment, she sees the embroidered footmat in front of her door. As Joan opens the door, Annie mentions that Ellen used to make mats like that too. Joan sounds impressed, but she then tells Annie to sit down so they can talk. During their conversation, Annie confides in Joan by telling her how she feels about losing Charlie. Joan then asks what her relationship with Peter looks like.
How was your relationship with your son?
And Annie says before the accident, they always argued a lot. She then mentions that it all started one day when she sleepwalked into his room and almost set him on fire. She adds that even though she didn't intentionally do it, Peter never believed she was sleepwalking. After her meeting with Joan, Annie heads home and joins her family for dinner. As they're eating, Peter commends his dad for making a nice meal.
This is really good, Dad.
And while Steve appreciates this, Annie looks annoyed. Peter then asks if there's anything she wants to say to him, and this triggers her to speak her mind about how he has never apologized for being responsible for Charlie's death. Things get quite heated between them, and Peter also blames Annie for letting Charlie go to the party even though she wanted to stay at home. Before the argument worsens, Steve eventually tells them to stop. Days later, while Annie is at a mall, she sees a nervous Joan in the parking lot.
Oh! Annie!
As they start talking, Joan mentions that she recently met someone who taught her how to conjure her dead son and grandchild. Annie believes Joan has lost her mind, but the woman says it worked. She also mentions that Annie won't understand until she sees it herself, so Annie follows her home. As they arrive at her apartment, Joan lights a candle and places her hand on a cup, after which she tells Annie to do the same. Even though Annie still has doubts, she follows Joan's instructions. As Joan then conjures the spirit of her grandson, she tells him to move the cup to confirm that he's there. Surprisingly, the cup moves, and this shocks Annie,
If you're here.
who eventually gets terrified as the spirit also touches her. Following this, Annie says she wants to leave. However, Joan stops her and says it's possible to do the same thing for Charlie. As Annie agrees to try it, Joan teaches her what to do and tells her to make sure everyone in her family, including Peter, is at home when she does it. That night, as Annie struggles to sleep, she suddenly has a nightmare where she sees Peter's body being attacked by insects. When she eventually wakes up, she decides to do what Joan taught her. Shortly after, she suddenly wakes Peter and Steve to come to the living room for something important. She then mentions that she just tried something that worked, and she'd like them to see it again. Steve doesn't understand what she's talking about, but Annie manages to convince him and Peter to touch a cup on the table. As she then calls on Charlie to move the cup, Steve believes his wife is being delusional. However, the cup moves, and this leaves Peter and Steve shocked, as Annie then tells Charlie's spirit to draw inside her sketchbook like she did a few minutes earlier. Steve refuses to let her continue because she's making Peter scared. Despite this, Annie still insists that she wants them to believe her. Suddenly, they hear a glass break behind them. As they wonder what's happening, the candlelight goes off and on. Just then, Annie gets possessed and starts speaking with Charlie's voice. This terrifies Peter, and as Steve appears to have had enough of it, he pours water on Annie to make her stop. The next day in class, Peter sees a glowing orb moving around. When the orb disappears, Peter then looks at a glass window and sees himself smiling, even though he's not doing that. This scares him, and he immediately leaves the classroom. After a while, Steve calls Annie to blame her for making Peter scared. He ends the call abruptly, but she angrily calls him back to tell him to stop treating her like she's not okay. Later that day, when Steve and Peter return home, they find Annie in her workshop with all her designs scattered around and destroyed. When Steve asks why she did it, she says she got tired of looking at them. That night, Annie struggles to sleep, and as she walks out of her room and enters Charlie's room, she sees an invisible spirit drawing inside Charlie's sketchbook. Meanwhile, Peter suddenly hears a tongue-clicking sound while sleeping. As he wakes up, he sees Charlie in the corner of his room, but she eventually disappears. Suddenly, someone starts pulling his head. But as he struggles to break free, he sees Annie in his room. Peter then accuses her of trying to kill him, but she says she would never hurt him. She adds that she's going to do something about what's happening in the house. Just then, she returns to Charlie's room and picks up the sketchbook, which has a drawing of Peter being possessed. Following this, she throws the sketchbook into the fireplace, but as it starts burning, a part of her clothes start burning too. This gets her shocked, but as she removes the book and puts out the fire, her clothes stop burning. The next day, Annie goes to Joan's house to ask about what's happening. Unfortunately, Joan is not at home, but it turns out that she has been performing a lot of rituals with Peter's picture, which is inside a triangle on her table. While Annie is outside the apartment, still knocking on the door, she suddenly stops and looks at the embroidered footmat again. She then suddenly remembers something and runs home immediately. Elsewhere, Peter sits alone outside his classroom while the other kids are playing around. He then hears Joan calling him from across the road, as if she were calling on a spirit.
Get out!
Peter looks confused because he's the only one hearing her, but he doesn't say anything. Meanwhile, Annie arrives home and goes through Ellen's things again. Inside the box, she then sees an embroidered mat with her name on it. She also sees a book with painted lines on a ritual to trap the spirit of a monster inside a vulnerable host. As she reads further, she learns that the monster is a demon king named Paimon, who prefers to have a male host. Annie is confused by this, but she then gets extremely shocked when she sees a photo album with pictures of Ellen and Joan. Back in school, Peter sees the glowing orb on his way to his classroom, and even though this scares him, he still walks in. After a while, a spirit suddenly possesses him and slams his head on the table several times until he breaks his nose. His classmates and teachers are shocked by this, and as he also regains control of his body, he screams in fear. Shortly after, Steve is called about what happened to Peter, so he goes to pick up his son from school. Just as they're near the house, Steve bursts into tears as he can't believe his family is falling apart. Meanwhile, Annie sees flies coming from the attic, so she goes to see what's inside. When she finally gets there, the place has an unbearable smell, and as she checks around, she sees her mom's headless body inside. Annie is shocked by this, but as she looks at the wall, she sees the painting of a strange symbol. When Steve returns, Annie immediately tells him to check the attic, but he refuses because he's not ready for her games. However, she manages to convince him, so he checks and sees the dead body. This leaves him shocked, but Annie says it has something to do with Joan. Steve doesn't know who that is, but Annie then mentions how they met. Annie adds that in Ellen's photo album, she and Joan wore a necklace with the same symbol as the one painted on the wall.
See the symbol on the necklace my mom gave me? It's her necklace, right?
As she suggests that her mom was the leader of a cult, Steve doesn't understand this, but he accuses Annie of digging up her mom's grave. Annie denies it, and she says that Joan has made them perform a ritual to bring a monster into the house. She also adds that the spirit is after Peter, but that she knows what to do. As Steve wonders what she means, she shows him the sketchbook and mentions that she saw it get filled with drawings of Peter getting possessed.
Phil, all of them!
She adds that when she tried to burn it, her clothes also caught fire, and that it means she needs to sacrifice herself to make everything return to normal. Steve is still confused, but she hands him the sketchbook and begs him to throw it into the fireplace because she's scared to kill herself. Steve takes the book, but he refuses to throw it in. Suddenly, Annie takes the book from him and throws it inside herself. However, Steve bursts into flames, and Annie looks terrified as she watches, but after a while, she gets possessed by the demon. Shortly after, Peter wakes up and hears a strange sound in the house. As he then heads to the living room, he sees his dad's burnt body and looks terrified, while being unaware that Annie is hanging on the wall behind him. Before he knows what's happening, he starts seeing weird things around the house, but after a while, Annie starts chasing him. He eventually runs into the attic, but Annie's possessed body keeps banging her head on the attic's entrance. When the banging stops, Peter looks around the attic and sees his picture in the middle of many candles, which is part of a ritual. Suddenly, blood starts dropping from the ceiling, and he then sees Annie killing herself. This gets him scared, and he jumps out of the attic window and falls badly on the ground. This makes him unconscious for a while, but when he wakes up, he sees Annie's headless body floating into Charlie's treehouse. As he stands up, Peter starts clicking his tongue. He then enters the treehouse where he sees Charlie's head on a mannequin, with several people who are part of Ellen's cult bowing before it. He looks shocked to see this, but as he looks at the wall, he sees a picture of Ellen being referred to as Queen Lee. Following this, Joan shows up and removes the crown on Charlie's head before putting it on Peter's head. She then calls him Charlie and proclaims him as one of the kings of hell named Paimon. She adds that with Peter's body, Paimon will now have a male host instead of Charlie's body. While Peter then stands still as she's talking, Joan leads the others to hail him as King Paimon.